All right, let's get started here this evening. Again, thank you to our alumni, faculty, staff, retirees, emeriti, and friends who joined us here this evening. My name is Carrie Gotham, Director of Alumni Engagement, and I want to thank you for joining us here tonight, albeit a sobering, scary, and sad topic in many ways. We are especially appreciative with such short notice that you joined us here this evening. But many of us on campus were very fortunate to see this discussion last Friday. It was for students, faculty, and staff. It was interesting, it was informative, and it was a great opportunity to see different viewpoints from three of our very own experts in the political science and international studies department. We'll hear a bit more about them in a second, but I want to just kind of lay the ground rules here for this evening. We will first hear from our faculty, and they will set the stage with three different viewpoints and three different looks at the current crisis. And then we will open it up to you. It'll be your show to ask questions and pick their brains even more. So we're going to ask that folks remain muted throughout the discussion, and you will be able to put your questions in the chat. So just type your questions in the chat, and then we'll get at them once they are done presenting. It's a busy time. We're right in the heart of the second semester, but we are very thankful tonight to welcome SUNY Brockport's Department of Political Science and International Studies professors, Dr. Steve Jurek, Dr. Erik French, and Dr. Robert Shum. And I'm going to turn it over to Steve and get things kicked off tonight. Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, Gary. So I'm going to just do a little bit of background first, and then I'm going to keep prompting my colleagues to chime in when they can answer some of our questions. So I teach European politics and Russian politics, and I focus a lot on the EU and European integration. Some of you probably were in Eurosim with me or had done it before me. And so this is probably a topic that's of very much interest to you. I think what's even more interesting, the way the semester started was I was collaborating with a school in Ukraine. So we were doing what's called a COIL class, or a collaboration class, and I had a faculty member from the University of Lutsk. It was a National Technical Institute, and her class and my class were joined up, and we were doing a joint project together. And Carrie, if you show the map of Ukraine up, they're in the western part of Ukraine, and it was interesting. We're talking to our fellow students, and this is in the beginning of February, and we're talking to Ukrainians. We're asking them about the escalation of conflict, because it looked like Putin was doing more saber rattling. It looked like there was more tensions were rising. Well, in the western part of Ukraine, there's a city called Lutsk, so it would be actually to the left of the letter U in Ukraine. And when we talked to them, they said they're not afraid of it. They weren't worried about it. Yes, they were upset about Crimea being annexed by Russia. Yes, they were very upset about the fact that there was insurgency movements in the eastern part of Ukraine in what's called the Donbas region, but they didn't seem to be all that concerned. They said, oh, well, that's kind of over there. Within 10 days, by February 24th, there was a full-blown invasion, and Russia then decided that it was going to invade from a couple of different directions, from the north and from the eastern part of Ukraine. And then eventually we know that now they've invaded from the south. So that's kind of where things are at. And now there was radio silence. It was very difficult. We couldn't collaborate. We couldn't connect with our students. And obviously there was great concern. We did get through to them a little bit using WhatsApp. That was kind of the only way to get through to them. And since then, it's been a bit sketchy. Occasionally we can, occasionally we can't. And of course, we're very concerned for their well-being. So that's how this became such a relevant and kind of, so important for our students. And I thought it'd be a good idea to also have some of my colleagues come in and talk about the international relations part of it, the security policy, what this means for American foreign policy. And so Dr. Erik French is going to join us and talk a little bit about what that means for alliances and NATO and how this plays into that. And then Dr. Robert Shum is going to also talk about energy politics as well as international law, because I keep getting a lot of questions about these, and I feel that it's much better if I let my colleagues handle some of those. So I think to set things up, what's changed since last Friday, even for when we talked, there was roughly 800,000 refugees. Now the mark is at 2 million. This is a significant increase in the influx of a humanitarian crisis. We're watching it unfold in front of us. The EU is reporting now that they're expecting between 4 and 5 million. So this will be the greatest refugee crisis since World War II. So with that being said, I think I'm going to pass it over to Erik now to talk about, we're watching this unfold, and we have a lot of clamoring from the West saying, what can we do? Why can't we do more? And of course, the big question is about NATO and about when the United States can get involved and when they can't. So maybe Erik, you can touch base a little bit on what this means for alliance and security policy.
Yeah, so from a NATO perspective, it matters quite a bit because there's a large number of states who are parties to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, who used to be under the control of Russia in one way or the other, who now feel threatened in the aftermath of this Russian intervention in Ukraine, right? Ukraine itself is not a member of NATO, but most of the states around Ukraine are NATO members and are worried that Russia might one day attack them. And they've become more worried now that Russia has attacked Ukraine. So how has the US responded to this so far, right? The United States has made it pretty clear that it's not going to send forces to Ukraine itself. It's not going to intervene directly in the conflict. What the United States has done is deployed a number of new military forces to Europe and has redeployed some of its forces within Europe. Some of my students have been asking me, does that mean, is this a prelude to greater intervention in the Ukrainian conflict? But actually, those forces are being moved around for different reasons. So we have a new armored brigade combat team that's being sent to Europe. And within Europe, we've moved around some of our forces, especially to the Baltic states and Poland, who are very worried about an attack. So we've moved an infantry battalion to the Baltics. We've moved around some F-35, some attack helicopters to both the Baltics and Poland. And the first reason for that deployment is reassurance. So when allies get worried, they oftentimes seek out reassurance from their partners, right? They want to know that their allies will still ultimately be willing to protect them in the face of foreign aggression. They want to know that everything is okay, right? It's sort of the same as if you might ask your wife or your husband, right? Do you still love me, right? And if they say yes, you're good to go. If they say no, you might start rethinking your marriage. And it's the same thing with some of these Eastern European allies. They're looking for the US and other NATO members to provide that reassurance. And that's what the US is doing by sending these military forces. The forces are there to show these countries that we are serious about protecting them if they are attacked. And if we failed to provide those reassurances, the allies might start looking for other partners. They might be forced to look elsewhere for help. They might decide that NATO was no longer worthwhile and ditch the partnership or bandwagon with Russia. And the second reason for these deployments is deterrence, right? Which many of you will be familiar with already. When an alliance sees a rival acting in a belligerent way, in a threatening way, like Russia's doing right now, it'll try to send a clear message that, if the rival messes with the alliance, it'll get roughed up. So NATO's trying to convince Russia that if it moves into Lithuania or Latvia or Estonia or Poland, if it goes for the Suwalki Gap, that it's going to regret it, that NATO will go to war and stop Russia. So positioning those forces in Europe is meant to show Russia that the US and NATO are serious about this, and to put us in a better position to push Russia back if it were to pursue aggression against those states. And we're kind of putting our skin in the game, right? So the more guys and gals we have over there in uniform, the more Russia knows that if it attacks our partners, it's going to be attacking American forces in the process, which pretty much should leave no question in their mind that then the United States would get directly involved. And so all this ultimately is being done to hold the NATO alliance together, but not necessarily to protect Ukraine or to put the US in a position where it can intervene directly in Ukraine. And part of the reason why the United States would be very reluctant to intervene directly in Ukraine has to do with Russia's formidable conventional military, but also its formidable nuclear forces. So you may have seen recently some news surrounding the Russian nuclear arsenal, some discussion of threats that Putin issued relating to Russian nuclear forces. So how are nukes tied up in all of this? Russia has the most nuclear warheads out there in the world. It's got about 6,000, although most of them are in storage. And Russia recently announced, Vladimir Putin announced that he was putting Russia's nuclear forces on alert. And basically that means making sure the forces responsible for those weapons are ready, so that the weapons could be launched quickly and effectively, efficiently, if need be. And it looks like Russia held some drills, some practice runs with some of its submarine forces, with some of their land-based launch systems, just to check their preparedness. And this is kind of like drawing a pistol from a holster, right? And then checking it. You're not aiming it, you're not firing it, but you're making sure that you can if you need to. And what's more, people watching you, they're going to understand, they're going to get the message that you are ready to fight if need be. And, we can't know at the end of the day what's going on in Putin's head. Some people have said, he's got COVID, he's irrational, he's paranoid, he's been isolated, he's unstable. But arguably, there's also a rational explanation for what he's doing here by making these tacit nuclear threats. So to some extent, he could be doing this to get NATO states jumpy and worried, to make sure that they don't consider sending forces to help defend Ukraine. Right? So Russia, especially as it struggles to succeed in its push into Ukraine, especially as it begins to get bogged down, it doesn't want NATO to open up another front. It doesn't want NATO to send air power. And it would also prefer, NATO states not ship Ukraine weapons. It would prefer NATO states not sanction Russia. And so Russia wants to make NATO more worried about the risks of all sorts of different forms of assistance to Ukraine by hinting, not so subtly, that Russia is ready to use nuclear force if it feels directly threatened. And so while the United States may be willing to risk providing military assistance in the form of arms transfers to arm the Ukrainian military, while it may be willing to sanction Russia quite severely, it isn't willing right now to risk sending air power to Ukraine or sending in ground forces, because it knows Russia might then choose to escalate to nuclear use. So from the Russian perspective, arguably, this could just be about deterrence at the end of the day. So ultimately, because of that deterrent, it doesn't really look like the United States is on the verge of doing anything to directly intervene in the conflict.
Good, thank you. And I think that part of it is, and a lot of people, and even one of the comments in the chat is, I don't think NATO should get involved. And it seems like cooler heads are prevailing thus far, in that, the knee-jerk reaction is we need to help, because we're watching this disastrous humanitarian crisis unfold, and it's only going to get worse. So we're going to sit by and watch, and especially with social media and the fact that it's being captured on so many different platforms, and the gut-wrenching stories that are coming out, it moves people, right? So it's a moral dilemma in some ways, and we'll come back to you a little bit more on that, and also about this idea of a no-fly zone and what that actually means, and maybe we'll even talk about unicorns and leprechauns with a limited no-fly zone, right? But I want to pass this now over to Rob, and I want you to shed a little bit on international law, because another one of the questions, and it sounds maybe elementary at first, but it's also, again, kind of a reaction that people get, which is, why isn't Putin held accountable in the International Court of Justice, so to speak? Why can't we go in and arrest him? So let us know.
Well, one of the things I think people want to keep in mind is that Russia is going to be has actually followed in the footsteps of the United States in terms of its positions towards the jurisdiction of international institutions. The United States has never signed on to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and indeed Congress passed a law, the American Service Persons Protection Act, which basically threatens to extract any American who gets taken by The Hague. So that is something that the US has taken the lead out on, and that Russia and China and India have all happily followed suit on. So there's no recognition of jurisdiction by any of the great powers right now. And you have these similar situations where international lawyers are trying to find ways to get some kind of process going, maybe going through the Human Rights Council, but you get the same problem where the United States has tried to delegitimize, again, the Human Rights Council, because human rights abusing countries are also sitting on it, because they've done things like commission the Goldstone report on the Israeli-Palestine situation that the United States disagreed with. The United States have strongly come on the record against the Human Rights Council doing anything. So it's interesting to have these sorts of discourses now where some American politicians are saying, oh yeah, let's get these institutions rolling, and freely disregarding, again, the ample precedents that have been set so far by the United States.
Good, thank you. And so international law obviously plays a heavy role in this, or lack thereof. And certainly if the United States isn't a signatory to it, it's going to cause a problem. And so maybe, Eric, now you can talk about what a no-fly zone means and the obligations that the United States and NATO would have if they were to actually go forward with trying to execute a no-fly zone. And then you can talk about that other other one as well.
Yeah, so the moral dimension of this is convoluted. It's always a moral dilemma when you're dealing with foreign policy. Very rarely is a state ever going to make foreign policy based solely on moral values. Moral values are always under consideration. They're one factor that may shape or constrain a state in terms of its policy, but they're never going to drive it. And so, and even if we look at this from a purely moral dimension, there's a moral piece of this when it comes to protecting Ukrainians from aggression. Self-defense is a just cause under just war theory. But at the same time, the United States also has an obligation to protect its own citizens. To some extent, that's its first moral obligation, is to the defense of its own territory and its own citizens. It also has a moral obligation to the defense of its allies. And so there's a question of balancing Ukraine's concerns with those of the United States and its allies. And given that intervening directly in a conflict in Ukraine risks nuclear war, risks significant damage to the United States and its allies, it's kind of questionable whether there's really a moral imperative for the United States to escalate its involvement in the conflict. I think the United States can definitely assist the Ukrainians. It can do so for moral reasons. It can also do so for self-interested reasons, right? Russia has traditionally been our rival. And so in this case, bogging them down in Ukraine could be beneficial from a US perspective, arming the Ukrainian insurgency so that they can fight on and make this a costly, painful conflict for Russia, I think is probably strategically a good idea. As far as a no-fly zone goes, we've seen more and more calls for some type of no-fly zone in Ukraine. And I tend to think that this is sort of the remnants of American primacy, right? For a long time, we were the dominant military power in the world. We still are militarily more powerful than pretty much any other actor. But part of the advantages of US primacy in the post-Cold War period was we could do things like no-fly zones in Bosnia, in Libya. We could pull it off because we were fighting against countries that were much weaker than we were, right? Because a no-fly zone is a military operation where basically you say, this airspace is off limits to a certain actor. And you know, that sounds really nice, no Russian planes allowed over Ukraine. But the thing is, you have to enforce an NFC. That means destroying Russian aircraft in flight. And to be able to do that, right, you're going to have to destroy Russian air defenses, probably some of its air bases too. Otherwise, your planes are just going to keep getting downed by Russian air defenses. And to do that, you would need a ton of strikes all across Ukraine and in Russia too, right? So Russia has S-300, S-400 air defenses that extend from Russian territory into Ukraine. And in the process of doing this, not only are you going to be hitting Russian troops, hitting the Russian homeland, but also the Russians are going to be fighting back. You're going to be doing this in the teeth of one of the world's best integrated air defenses, and they're going to score hits. And they will probably attack NATO air bases in Europe as well, at the very least. So this would mean effectively we would be engaging directly in a very bloody air war with Russia that could then escalate to a broader ground war with Russia if they decided to counterattack. And you know, there's also the risk that Russia could choose to use nuclear forces in response to this. Something that the Pentagon has talked about in the past is this escalate to de-escalate strategy that Russia has discussed, where effectively, if they get involved in a limited war with NATO, they might decide to threaten to use tactical nukes, right, small nukes, against military targets to try to convince the United States to back down. Right? And so in that case, the United States has two choices, right? We can call Russia's bluff and risk nukes being used against us, in which case we would retaliate, probably with nuclear use against Russia, or we would be forced to back down in a humiliating fashion. And even if the United States were to succeed in a no-fly zone, two other problems emerge, right? So first, most Russian supporting fires come from artillery and ground-based missile systems, not from aircraft, right? So Russian forces are still going to beat Ukraine back. This isn't going to deny them one of the primary advantages they have on the battlefield. And what's more, there's sort of a question as to what Russia would do in response. Again, I think there's always concerns about limited nuclear use in response to this type of intervention. So overall, I think a no-fly zone would be a pretty significant gamble. Right? It's possible you could control the escalation, but I'm not sure the US would ever really be willing to risk that, given that what's at stake in Ukraine for the US isn't existential. It's not an existential threat to America's continued survival.
Okay, good. Thank you. And we got a couple of really good questions in the chat, but I'm not going to let you off the hook, Eric. We'll come back to the limited no-fly zone in a second. But I want to ask Rob a question about, so Carrie, maybe go to the slide on the oil pipelines, please. And Rob, I want you to just weigh in on this because, you know, that was big news that Biden announced that the United States was no longer going to buy crude oil from Russia. So we were importing something like 600,000 barrels of crude oil a day. And you know, not doing that, what are the ramifications of this? This is a question that comes up a lot. And it's not necessarily, you know, that Americans don't care per se about what's going on in Ukraine, but they do ask, and what does this mean at the pump? And what does this mean about weaning the world off of Russian supply of oil and gas, which obviously they are major providers. So maybe you can touch upon that, please.
Well, the gas piece is, of course, most relevant in Europe because Europe doesn't have very much of its own gas. They get gas from Norway. They get some gas from Libya and from Qatar, and both from LNG, liquefied natural gas, from again the Middle East, but also pipelines from Norway. But otherwise, their economies are completely dependent on that. We take it for granted in the United States that we export natural gas, right? And this is one of the things we've talked about. Is again one of the things we can do is to ship more liquefied natural gas from the United States because there is so much of it being produced from fracking. And it's something that again in Europe, however, is the big concern. Again, the questions for Europe become a long-term sort of issue. Again, Germany shut down its nuclear weapons, which means that they're even more nuclear power plants, so they're even more dependent on Russian gas for powering their economy. For using power plants and whatnot, in addition to for building, heating, and whatnot. So that has been a big part of the issue. Again, this Nord Stream 2 pipeline that was built to bypass Ukraine, to directly give Russia leverage over Germany, right, in these sorts of situations. So that's the gas situation. On the oil situation, again, the United States has announced sanctions. People may be surprised that the United States, again, people may be more or less surprised that the United States imports oil from Russia. Again, it's not a huge amount, but it's there because in a global market, refineries are set to import certain specific grades of oil. And it's just the cheapest kind of grade to get for some refiners is Russian oil. This has been exacerbated by American protectionism. There's something called the Jones Act, which means that if you do any kind of cargo shipping from one American port to another American port, it has to be under an American flagged ship. And there aren't any American flagged tankers that do this efficiently. So even though the United States has ramped up so much oil production and is a net, again, not an importer, it's not feasible really to get down to move oil from one ship to another within the United States, by one tanker port to another. And so that's why the United States is importing from Russia, and why there is this additional sanction that can be announced, which isn't going to have much impact, I mean, for the United States. I mean, again, those ports, those refineries that are importing Russian oil, they'll pay a little more for some kind of non-Russian supply. And Russia will have to sell that oil to somebody else at maybe a slightly lower price. So it's not a huge impact. It's mostly symbolic. And again, more significantly is that part of the package that the US has also announced, that there's restrictions on investment by U.S. companies on Russia, and so if that's kept on as a sanction, that's something that's likely to have a greater impact.
Yeah, and I think that the story continues, or at least the origin story of how much energy plays into this goes back even to the days of the Soviet Union. So one of the ways that the Soviet Union, everyone remembers, it's made up of 15 different Soviet socialist republics. The way they kept the periphery republics in line was basically Moscow was subsidizing their energy. right? They were giving it for real cheap. And this kind of ties in with one of the first questions that we'll go with in the chat here about why Russia's targeting Ukraine and not others per se like Belarus. Well, when the Soviet Union collapsed, these cheap supply of energy continued for a while, but then as they were attempting to approach more and more of a capitalist economy, you got to let the market dictate the price. Well, Ukrainians, it's a very poor country. It's the third poorest in Europe. They can't afford to pay market prices. In the meantime, Russia is still supplying much of the EU, much of the European Union, its energy needs. But the transit is through Ukraine. And you can see from the map that all those different pipelines of all the energy coming through Ukraine. Well, Ukrainians were doing this. They were siphoning off gas because they couldn't pay the market prices. Well, in 2009, the Gazprom, which is a state-owned largest Russian gas company, stops the supply of natural gas because they're upset that they're not paying the market price and because they're not able to they keep siphoning off. And so they're labeling it as being this, corrupt regime and that Ukraine is not able to play by the rules, so to speak. This also happens to be the time when Ukraine just previously had flirted with, had NATO overtures. So I think there was some of that mixed up in this. But to get to the question about why is Ukraine now the target is, well, I mean, that's a great question, but Belarus is kind of the junior partner to Russia, and they're hook, line, and sink in step with Putin. The current dictator there has actually been in power longer than Putin. So Lukashenko has been around since 1994, which predates Putin by 5 years, and he depends upon his security being in power is from Putin. He's basically bought him off. But the interesting thing about this is that Putin has said that Ukrainians and Russians are no different. He doesn't recognize the sovereignty of Ukrainian territory because he doesn't think that they're any different than Russians. But in actuality, there's more in common with Ukrainians with Belarusians. Their language actually shares something like 84% is in the same lexicon together, as with Russia, it's actually less than that, something like 62% or something like that. So Ukrainians and Belarusians are almost like Croatians and Serbians, where it's basically intelligible between the both of them. But if you're thinking about, say, Afrikaans and Dutch, that's how it would be between Russians and Ukrainians, right? So Ukrainians can typically understand Russian, and they do speak a lot of Russian, but Russians don't necessarily understand Ukrainian. And so there are a lot of differences there, but Putin has kind of washed over that. And so there's a whole bunch of reasons why, some are targeted over others, but certainly the thing that I want to bring Erik in on this too is, Ukraine does not pose an economic threat to Russia. They do not pose a military threat to Russia. And it's really hard pressed to say that they are threatening Russia by being democratic, because it's a flawed democracy, right? There's been a lot of corruption. There's been 2 elections that have actually been overthrown, even though they've been overthrown in pro-Western candidates. Russia perceives this to be dangerous and that this is a bad thing. So why is Russia doing this? What other motive could there be if they're really not threatened by them? I mean, empirically, they're not.
Yeah, so it's tricky. I mean, I can't speak too much to why Putin feels threatened by Ukraine. I think part of it is trying to exploit an opportunity he perceives just as much as it is responding to a threat. But I also think a key reason why Ukraine and not other states is NATO, maybe not in the way you're thinking, but most of the other states that are former bloc countries are in NATO, right? So you're either with Putin in the case of Belarus, or you have NATO protection, and so Russia can't interfere in you, or it risks war with the largest and most powerful military alliance in the world, like the Baltic states, like Poland, or you're a country that's subject to Russian military invasion intervention, like Georgia or like Ukraine, right? Which is part of the reason why when countries like Ukraine begin to create distance between themselves and Russia, they are very interested in joining NATO, right? Because really the track record so far in Eastern Europe and Central Asia is you're either in NATO or you get intervened in by Russia. You become a target for potential military intervention by Russia, or you have to kowtow to whatever it is Putin wants. So you can understand why Kyiv was so interested in seeking closer ties with the West.
Yeah, good. And we should note too that on this map that actually North Macedonia is also a member of NATO. And so I think Erik's right. I mean, thinking about the track record, if you're in NATO, you don't get invaded. If you're not in NATO, you can be invaded, which is why countries have been running to Brussels, where NATO's headquarters are, saying, how do we get in? So I think that's an important consideration to take in mind. So another question here, and I think either of you can weigh in on this. Although the U.S. is not sending troops to Ukraine, what do you think happens if the thousands of American volunteers follow through with their plans to fight for Ukraine? What is the legal status of these people? And actually, Kyiv has also said that there's been 20,000 international citizens of the world, basically have from 52 different countries, have joined the Ukrainian Foreign Legion. They're issued a Ukrainian passport and they are given a gun if they didn't bring one with them. So either of you can comment on that. What happens with them?
So I'll let Rob talk about the legal ramifications. I'm not really sure on that front. But I know just it's in terms of the geopolitics of it, the United States is not going to guarantee the safety of American nationals that go and fight in Ukraine. It's not going to evacuate them. It's not going to provide them with significant protection. So if you go and fight in the Ukrainian International Foreign Legion, you're pretty much on your own at that point. I think as long as these are private citizens, as long as they're not in uniform, in American uniforms, in US military uniforms, it's not going to lead Russia to escalate directly against NATO or against the United States. What Russia may try to do, though, is close down some of the corridors through which foreign volunteers may be moving into Ukraine and weapons may be moving into Ukraine. That could actually be a source of some tension between Russia and NATO states in the coming months. Is, if Russia succeeds in occupying Ukraine, you're going to see more of an insurgency, right? Kind of like Pasoon's talking about in the comments here. You will see more of an insurgency against Russian control, in which case the United States is going to be, and NATO countries are going to be sending a lot of military equipment to help that insurgency continue, to bog the Russians down. And for Russia, one of the things it will inevitably try to do is close down our ability to do that. And then you run into the possibility of some clashes on the border. If Russia chooses to target convoys or equipment that's headed into Ukraine, it might choose to start hitting it further and further outside the Ukrainian border. And so that might be a potential flashpoint in Western Russian relations.
Good, thank you. Another question, Rob, go ahead.
Oh, no, I just wanted to add that, people doing so are obviously doing it at their own risk. Not even if you're fighting, as we've seen with the WNBA star that has now basically been taken hostage by Putin when she went to go and play in Russia. So there's not, other than that, there's not any special legal status, obviously, for people going to fight. If anybody's considering it, I would advise you to read George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, because I think the greatest historical precedent for this is, of course, the Spanish Civil War, where there's a Lincoln battalion. Many idealistic Americans went to fight and ended up being very disillusioned and disappointed. Also the subject of Hemingway's great novel. So that is something to think about in terms of historical precedent.
I can count on you for bringing in those references. Thank you. The next one that comes up a lot too is about economic sanctions. So I think everyone is surprised on the solidarity with which the West has, how quickly the economic sanctions were put in place. And we've kind of mused before that 4 super yachts have now been seized. The French got one and the Germans got one, I think the biggest one so far. But the Italians, not to be outdone, they got 2 of them so far. But the question is who do economic sanctions actually hurt, right? I mean, if a billionaire, a Russian oligarch loses his super yacht, I mean, really, is that going to bring Putin to his knees? And how effective can they be to alter Russian strategy? And I'll let either of you jump in on that.
Well, when it comes to the sanctions, there are a lot of things to talk about. I don't know if you want to turn the camera back on. I have a little prop in terms of economic sanctions. But first of all, in terms of financial sanctions and oil sanctions, of course, those are, I've already touched about the oil sanctions, but the financial sanctions is really the big story, right? The fact that the central bank of Russia basically has been cut off. People talk about how Russia and China have built up all of their foreign currency reserves. But the thing is, if you buy foreign currency, that's usually it's just an entry, like in the financial books. It's and it's something that can be cut off, right? If you've left it in the again on deposit with the Federal Reserve or something like that, it can be cut off. And so that has been a big thing. That's why you've seen the ruble collapse, because people are betting that Russia won't be able to access all of its foreign currency reserves. It is going to come to a sudden stop, like countries like Argentina or Indonesia, for example, right? They've been cut off by the SWIFT messaging system, which is going to make transfers so much more difficult. It's going to make large financial transfers in US dollars next to impossible. That actually carries on through to China. In terms of, we've already seen reports that state banks in China have ceased allowing transactions to take place, even to buy Russian commodities in US dollars, because they don't want to be hit by the secondary sanctions. And that China, again, does so much more trade, is so much more dependent on trade with the US and the EU, and the banks certainly have an interest in not being cut off, as the financial sanctions certainly have done so far. So it is an interesting question. Again, I don't need any of these slides. So again, if we want to turn on the camera directly, I can also talk a little bit about the boycotts. Again, that's been taking place. Of course, I recently acquired a bottle of the one true Ukrainian vodka that is available in the United States. It's interesting to see, again, part of the outcry that people have had is that they don't want to buy allegedly Russian vodka. But one of the funny things is that Russian vodka is it's practically non-existent in the U.S. market. Again, Smirnoff is distilled in Illinois. Stoli is distilled in Latvia, one of our NATO allies, our key NATO allies. So it's an interesting sort of situation where there's not that much to hit other than oil and gas, right? There's just not that much that people buy from Russia.
What about Kamchatka? Where's Kamchatka made?
I don't know. I've never seen that brand. Russian Standard is the highest, it's the best-selling actual vodka that's actually brewed, that's actually distilled in Russia. That's all I know. I don't know about Kamchatka. But I am I enjoy this cocktail hour, so I'm going to, anyway, partake of my little vodka tonic here. I'm going to keep my mic on too, because again, I really hope that we have more of a discussion here. We're all adults here, unlike when we have to do it for students. So anyway, I'm going to jump in and just cut off Steve at all points, and I wanted to talk now.
Well, I welcome that, because I already scored a victory by stumping you once, so I feel satisfied. Right. But on a more serious note, though, and Erik, you can weigh in too, but Putin had to know this was coming. Right? Economic sanctions had already been in place, right? The U.S. and part of its Western allies had done this since the annexation of Crimea in 2014, right? So when we talk about this, we're not talking about a new war in Ukraine. They've been in there since 2014. So sanctions had been placed on Putin, and yet that deterrence, because this plays into you with foreign policy, right? Deterrence didn't work, and so he just grossly underestimated the resolve of the Western response. And what is it? He couldn't have said, gee, they're not going to do anything. They're just going to let me march.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two things. I think part of it is actually there may have been some I think he may have misunderstood how far the West was willing to go in these sanctions. I think that's possible. We kind of gave him a slap on the wrist in terms of sanctions after Crimea. And this response has been just much, much more forceful. I'm not sure Putin thought that, Germany, for instance, would be willing to go as far as it has. I think he may have overestimated the amount of leverage that Russian gas and oil gave him geopolitically. That's one possibility. Another possibility, though, is that Putin just is confident that he can ride out sanctions. I think there was a lot of confidence in the Kremlin that they were going to be able to roll over Russian defense or Ukrainian defenses very quickly and easily. They have been much less successful than pretty much every analyst expected they would be in their conventional military operations, getting bogged down very easily, not fighting very effectively, not using combined arms well. Very poor low-level leadership in the Russian military, very poor performance so far. And so I think he may have expected he'd be able to get a quick victory, present the West with a fait accompli, and at that point, it wouldn't be too long until things would begin to go back to normal. Some of the more extreme sanctions would get lifted. And then finally, even in the odd chance that he expected this would be longer and harder than many of us thought it would be, I still think he's confident that he can maintain control in Russia, even in the face of economic hardship, because classically, many dictators have been able to stay in power despite crippling economic sanctions. Kim Jong-un has stayed in power despite crippling economic sanctions. Saddam Hussein stayed in power despite incredibly crippling economic sanctions. And Maduro has stayed in power in Venezuela despite pretty significant sanctions. Part of that is, ultimately sometimes, people can muddle through, even in the face of economic hardship. There's a lot of hurt that a nation can take. What's more, dictators have been very adept in the past of using sanctions to kind of rally the people behind them, to sort of play the victim, to say, look, the West is out to get us. They're persecuting us economically. Rally behind my leadership. We have to resist this. Keep calm and carry on, almost, right, to some extent. And so I think all of that plays a role.
Because of the state TV is controlled by Russia, so the messaging is the same consistently.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's deemed illegal now for any of the media within Russia to use the word war or invasion when you're describing the conflict in Ukraine. So that's kind of a big deal. And there's a whole bunch of things you can add on to this. But TikTok is no longer being operable in Russia, and that's a Chinese-owned company. But I guess I'll throw this at you, Rob, because I don't know if I wanted to go down this rabbit hole, but I think I have to, because I get these questions a lot too. Is that, okay, Putin may have thought that he was going to weather this storm, and maybe he underestimated it, the Western reaction, and how he was going to be frozen out of the Western world and the international economy. But maybe he was really doing this on purpose to destroy the ruble. I mean, look at it. It's now worth practically nothing. And some are saying, well, that's because he was going to wipe out the entire system to go to cryptocurrency.
Well, what's fascinating is he's not going to be able to drink Pepsi anymore, Steve.
Yeah.
I mean, Pepsi, which went into Russia when, in 1970s, I believe. You'll know this better than I do, but right, at one point had to accept Russian submarines for payment because, again, they had no hard currency, right? At some point. So, I mean, in terms of the exodus of companies, certainly it's stunning. Again, McDonald's is left. So now Friedman's hypothesis that no two countries with McDonald's is back on the table, I guess, right? So it's an absolutely crazy situation, right? The sanctions are absolutely unprecedented. They're going to hurt, but the problem is, how long is it going to take? It's not that sanctions are ineffective, it's that autocratic repression is effective too, as Erik has talked about in a lot of those examples. I think the best example that I'm most familiar with, again, is the other petrostate, right? Venezuela. They've been subject to crippling sanctions for some time now. Their economy has been contracting, like you're talking about double-digit contractions, but Maduro manages to hold on. Maduro, I mean, you can see Chavez holding on as being a rather charismatic, sort of skilled politician, but Maduro, I mean, so it's just, the autocrats have so much, again, at their disposal. One of the things about, again, the sort of how exactly is sanctions going to trigger, regime change, right? It's an interesting, I've been reading, there was this first a Twitter thread and then this article by Olga Kij, a Ukrainian political scientist, Ukrainian-born political scientist who now teaches in the University of Toronto, talking about, we focus on the oligarchs, but we forget that, the real base for Putin is the Siloviki, right? The security forces, the strong people. And they're backed into the corner as much as Putin is. And sanctions, again, if anything, strengthens their position against the oligarch faction. And so that's a cause for sort of the pessimism there.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And I think another part too, and this comes in the chat too, is there's kind of two cards that have been played or not played that are kind of interesting. So the Russian Air Force really hasn't been used, right? And it could. So we have to ask ourselves, why? Why is Putin not doing that? Why is he not escalating it into doing what he did in Chechnya, which was to raise Grozny to the ground? Why not? He's been known to do that. And then the second one is, if you're thinking about possibilities for exposing Putin and perhaps weakness, the Russians themselves are going to have to be upset at the war in Ukraine, and perhaps them using conscripts now, which is one of the comments. Why is Russia using conscripts? Because he said from the beginning that he wouldn't. This was going to be just all volunteers. So what happens when you start to see, body bags, going home back to Russia, and you can't hide that. You can't. The state TV can't fudge deaths. Mothers know, fathers know when their children don't come home. So those kind of two things, if either you want to comment on those.
Again, it depends on the narrative that you spin, though, right? Because casualties, even in the United States, actually, fatalities in a war don't necessarily trigger a huge backlash against the war. A lot of the research we have by people like Bruce Gentleson, Peter Feaver, others, has indicated that actually people will respond to casualties, but they'll tend to continue to support a war as long as they think that either it's beneficial to the country or it's succeeding. There's an opportunity for it to succeed. And I think in the Russian case, it's probably even easier, right? If the state can spin that the conflict is for national security against an encroaching West, against an encroaching NATO, and especially if they can continue to pitch the idea that really we're protecting our brethren in Ukraine against a coup that was brought about in 2014, full of Nazis and right-wingers who want to eradicate our Ukrainian brethren and commit acts of genocide, right? If they can keep pitching this, then the tolerance for casualties and for fatalities may be higher than you might expect, right? Because people don't like to see their sons and daughters killed, but they're more willing to accept that sacrifice if they think it's worthwhile, if they think it's going towards something noble. And nationalism is very potent in Russia. And I think we have to be careful to not underestimate the strength of nationalism in Russia and the attachment to the Russian nation.
Good. Okay, thank you. If anybody else has any other questions, you can post them in the chat. We can go on for a long time on all kinds of different tangents and threads. I think we've covered some of the major areas here. I think it's important to note that Georgia and Moldova have asked to be fast-tracked on joining the European Union. We know that Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, has also asked for that. And that's been a question that I got direct messaged previously from someone else. And actually a person who's watching this from Italy. So if they're on, hi, how are you? The question is that really possible? And the answer is no, right? That's a symbolic gesture. If the EU were to somehow say you're granted special application candidacy status, that's kind of like a limited no-fly zone. That's a leprechaun and a unicorn. It doesn't exist. Joining the EU is a long, arduous process. It takes years to meet the certain criteria that they want and to close the chapters on a session. So much so that had the Scottish referendum on independence been successful and that they were able to become their own independent Scotland when the UK was part of the European Union said no to Scotland, that they would automatically still be in the European Union. They would have had to reapply to be a member of the European Union, even though they were already in it. So the EU is oftentimes criticized rightly for being overly bureaucratic, and there's so many rules and regulations in order to do it, that Zelensky asking for kind of fast track into the EU, it's not going to happen. Not to mention just that, there's also a mutual defense clause in the European Union's treaties. So when you join, automatically, now it's not like NATO because the EU doesn't have the military forces, of course, but a mutual defense clause says that you must do everything you can. And I thought this was interesting too, is that some Irish parliamentarians in Dublin went on record and saying that, is that if Ireland is not in NATO, but they said, listen, if the Baltics are attacked, we will come to their aid in any way we can. So, if you're going to get the Irish mad at you, it could be pretty troublesome, right, Rob?
Yeah, crikey. Crikey, you don't want the Irish mad at you.
Yeah, and it's interesting, just to speak to the no-fly zone thing, right? Because I never came back to the limited no-fly zone. And also, I want to address quickly Pasoon's question about weapons proliferation and right-wing groups in Ukraine. So on the limited no-fly zone, some people have been pushing for a no-fly zone that would just encompass the western regions of Ukraine, which sounds, again, appealing because everybody wants to do something. Everybody wants to help the Ukrainians, and I get that impulse. But even a limited no-fly zone that was just designed to protect humanitarian corridors in Western Ukraine would still be facing Russian integrated air defenses, would still have to take those air defenses out. And what's more, the big problem here is when humanitarian convoys are getting hit, when refugees are getting hit, when they're getting attacked, it's not usually from explosives dropping out of an aircraft. That's usually not what's happening. It's not from a MiG or a Su-35. It's from artillery, right? And so if you really wanted to protect refugees fleeing Ukraine, it's not enough to do a no-fly zone. You would need to take out Russian artillery systems, and again, that would be a significant escalation. And so the utility of a limited no-fly zone is pretty limited at the end of the day. And to Pasoon's question in the comments, are we worried? Kind of like, we armed the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and that came back to bite us eventually, right? In their war against the Soviet Union. Could something like that happen in Ukraine today? I mean, so there's always the risk that unsavory groups will get access to some of these systems, right? Stingers and javelins are floating around in Ukraine. But I do think that it's easy to overestimate the presence of some of these right-wing groups in Ukraine. I think Russian media has played a big role in trying to portray all Ukrainian governmental forces and pro-governmental militias as Nazis, right? There are some groups that will bring out Nazi and fascist propaganda, but we shouldn't overestimate their presence. And also the thing we have to remember is the same way the US was willing to run the risk of arming the Mujahideen in Afghanistan because it was worried about a great power. Today, the United States is more willing to risk these weapons falling into the wrong hands because we're worried about a bigger fish. There's a bigger fish to fry than insurgents, than terrorists. It's a great power, right? It's Russia. That's what we're concerned about here. And increasingly, you've seen with the last two administrations, with both Biden and Trump, their national security planning indicates the US is no longer primarily concerned with terrorism. We are primarily concerned with countering great power threats more than anyone else, China, but also Russia. Right. And so if it takes arming some potentially somewhat unsavory characters to keep one of these states in check, the United States is going to be more receptive to that than it was in the past. But again, I do want to reinforce that the number of these right wingers in Ukraine has been inflated by Russian propaganda.
I think that's good to point out because this whole denazification of Ukraine, and they're overplaying this, that somehow that's run amok. And yes, it's true. While the Euromaidan protests did occur, there were right-wing groups that had shown their face, and they had the symbols and the different types of things. But that was not what the mass movement was about. This was about protesting the president at the time, who was pro-Kremlin, who was balking at signing the European, an EU deal, basically, which was about a free trade agreement, which is really not all that integrative. And he balked at it because Putin made him a more favorable offer. So it's good to kind of keep that in check because that's kind of the go-to. Another thing I wanted to say and is that one thing that Russia was upset at, and people should understand this too, is that Putin has a very close connection with the Russian Orthodoxy Church. And so it's not like he's the de facto head of it, but it kind of is. Like, he gives his blessing to the patriarch, and the patriarch says, we're going to support your policies. A couple of years ago, there was no separate Ukrainian Orthodoxy the way that it's recognized now. They made movements to become their separate own Christian branch, basically, of the Eastern Orthodoxy, and it was recognized. And so Ukraine has its own patriarch, and they have their own Ukrainian Orthodoxy, and Russia did not like that. Putin did not like that. That was a rift that he did not like, as well as some of these other factors that we've talked about. Let's see if we have a question from, let's see, a couple more in here in the chat. Kind of old news now. Sean's asking about What about the intelligence sharing? Because the United States at first was very reluctant to share intelligence about troop movements of Russia. And was that a mistake? Should the US be supplying intel to Ukraine?
I mean, I think that at this point, right, there should be an interest in doing some intelligence sharing with the Ukrainians, especially if our interest is trying to bog Russia down, keep Russia from achieving quick and easy success. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't see a clear downside to that unless we're worried that sharing too much information may lead to certain sources being compromised, especially if we're worried about Ukrainian figures, intelligence and security service leaders being captured if Russia succeeds in invading and occupying Ukraine. I mean, that might be part of the concern. In the same way, there's been some concern about sharing higher end, more technologically advanced weapon systems with the Ukrainians, because there's a good chance that the Russians will end up controlling those systems. Right? So the Poles have been talking about sharing some of their MiGs with the Ukrainians. That's been a subject of a bit of a kerfluffle between us and the Poles over exactly how those MiGs would get to Ukraine. But if the Poles want to get those MiGs to Ukraine, they're going to have to strip off some of the systems that they've got on them, because again, there's a chance that they could end up in Russian hands. And some of the systems the Poles have on their fighters weren't made in Russia, right? And they would be not too thrilled if Russia got a hold of some of them. So that's always a concern.
Good, thanks, Erik. And then I want you to think about Tambria's question.
Yeah.
She's listening to us from, or watching us from the UK. So we best answer her question since she's 6 hours ahead and staying up late for us. So we appreciate that, Tambria. But while Erik, you're thinking about that, any of us can probably comment on Pasoon's question. If Russia succeeds in Ukraine, does it send a signal to China to attack on Taiwan? Does the response of the US would be different in the case of Taiwan rather? And of course, Erik, that's their area as well. That's certainly one that comes up. People ask that. I mean, I'm going to throw a different one at you. I mean, if you're Georgia or if you're Moldova, this is the time to take back for Moldova Transnistria. This is the time for Georgia to take back South Ossetia and Abkhazia, because Russia's busy. What do you think of that, Rob?
I'm not going to comment on the international security stuff, but I know a lot of us have to sign off at 7:30. And when you ask about the question of what is the message that's being sent to different constituencies, I just want to close out. And the one thing I want to point out is, what is the message that's being sent to the American people, right? I think this crisis has been a true wake-up call in terms of showing that participation in the international economic system is not a source of weakness. It's a source of strength in terms of how strongly we've been able to basically shut down the Russian economy. International alliances, participation in international institutions and organizations, that there's reasons to support the United Nations or the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice. These are all sources of strength for the United States. Even though, again, in recent years, it's popular both on left and right to say, oh, we're getting killed by all these, by the international community and stuff like that. This has been a real wake-up call, and I really hope that these lessons actually are learned for more than just a couple of months before people forget and start watching, again, Dancing with the Stars in the next NFL season after this crisis is over.
And that's not the booze talking, right?
That is completely the booze talking, but like I said, core booze, core vodka, core platinum, brewed in Ukraine. Good stuff, man.
So to Tambria's question, I can't really speak to the gender dimension as it's not my field. It would kind of be like a linguistics professor commenting on geopolitics, which is not very helpful. In terms of imperialism, though, I mean, clearly Putin's narrative draws heavily on ideas about imperial legacies, and that's something Dr. Jurek probably knows a lot about. Putin harkens back to Kievan Rus, the old medieval confederation / empire, is the basis for his claim that Ukraine is part of Russia. And he also emphasizes that the Russian Empire under the Tsars controlled Ukraine. He's written about it. He's written essays about it and published those essays, essays that probably wouldn't pass basic history class, but he's written about it, right? And so the justifications for Russian designs in Ukraine are in some ways imperial. He's using the fact that these former empires controlled these spaces, carved them out through conquest, as the basis for claims to seize this territory and exercise influence in this territory. It's kind of revanchist more than anything else. The same approach has been used historically by imperialists to justify their claims on lands and peoples around them, right? So, this used to belong to the Germanic tribes, and so it's rightfully ours, and so on. And also denying nationhood to Ukraine is an important part of Putin's narrative. He calls them essentially parts of what is essentially the same historical and spiritual space. He's always talking about them belonging to the same spiritual space. And that's a very important idea or narrative he's tried to impose on the Ukrainians. And he's also tried to get the rest of the world to embrace it too. But I do think to some extent the US and Western response, emphasizing sovereignty, emphasizing Ukrainian nationhood, I think that does reflect a pushback against those imperial narratives, right? And I think Putin has failed, has fundamentally failed to convince anyone in Ukraine or in the West that Ukraine has no nationhood and does not deserve sovereignty, right? And so I think in that respect, the United States has been successful and the West has been successful and the Ukrainians have been successful in pushing back against that particular narrative. The human security side of things is very important. Again, not my area of expertise, but a concerted effort will need to be made to deal with refugees and to protect the people that are suffering as a result of this war, especially because, at the end of the day, for the United States, it's not in our interest to see Putin win quickly and easily. And while that's good from a national security perspective, it also means that Ukraine has hard days ahead, and the people who will remain in Ukraine have hard days ahead. And so we are going to have to give a lot of thought to how we handle refugees.
And it helps also rewrite the relationship between the United States and the European Union, because 2014, 2015, at the height of the refugee crisis, not just from the Syrian civil war, but also from Afghanistan refugees, Sudan, et cetera, there was over 1 million people that flooded into the European Union. We're talking about perhaps 4 to 5 million within the span of very, very short time, coming all directly from Ukraine. So that's going to really strain the European Union. And I think that the United States, and I think Rob is right, this served as a wake-up call. And I think that's a good way to kind of wrap up our discussion here. So if either of you have any kind of last closing comments, please do so. Rob did a great job with his. I think that's important to hammer home the point that, what we do matters and what happens in other places matter. And so we're glad to be discussing it, and we do this all the time. So we're happy to do this for the Alumni Association. So I want to thank Rob very much. Eric, if you have any other comment?
Just that I don't think Putin will draw, or I don't think Beijing will draw conclusions about this for Taiwan. The American interests in Taiwan are different from those in Ukraine. We have a tacit security guarantee for Taiwan that's not in place for Ukraine. And I just don't think that Beijing's going to conclude, hey, the Americans didn't fight in Ukraine, therefore they're not going to fight in Taiwan, despite all of our strong hints to the Chinese that we would fight if they chose to go after Taiwan.
Okay, yeah, because that comes up a lot too. People ask about that. So, all right, I want to thank Rob and Eric so much for doing this again, and we might be asked again someday down the line. And I want to thank everyone who tuned in tonight, and Carrie also. Thanks for kind of collecting this all together for us. And with that, I'll let you have the final word. And thank you very much, alumni.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Steve, Eric, Rob. We'll get you guys all a bottle of that Ukrainian vodka, Rob, that you were sharing here. And we want Rob at our next alumni happy hour. So thanks so much for jumping on tonight. And I know we can raise our hands, you can clap, but we really appreciate you guys taking the time, like I said, in the hardest semester to share your expertise and your thoughts with us. And we truly appreciate it. So thanks, everyone.